The system had been running for 11 hours when Dr. Lena Kovacs noticed the output had stopped making sense. Not crashed, not frozen. It was still producing results. Clean, structured, mathematically coherent results. But what those results were saying, what they were pointing to, was something she hadn't programmed it to find. Something no one had asked it to look for. She sat in that lab in Zurich at 2 a.m, the hum of servers filling the room, and she did something that veteran researchers almost never do. She called her mentor. At 2 a.m, because she needed someone else to look at it. She needed to know she wasn't seeing things. What Dr. Kovacs had stumbled onto that night in late 2024 wasn't a bug. It wasn't a hallucination in the model. It was a pattern. A repeating, structured, mathematically undeniable pattern buried inside the fundamental data of physical reality itself. And the AI had found it not because it was told to look, but because when you build a system smart enough to map the deep architecture of the universe, it finds things we weren't ready for. This is that story. And I have to warn you, by the time we're done, the way you think about your own existence, your own experience, the nature of everything you can see and touch and feel, is not going to be exactly the same as it was when you pressed play. For most of modern history, reality operated on an unspoken gentleman's agreement between science and human intuition. The agreement went something like this. The world is made of stuff, matter, particles, energy fields. It exists whether or not you're looking at it. The chair in the corner of your room is there when you leave. The moon hangs in the sky whether anyone's watching. The laws of physics are fixed, universal, and indifferent to the presence of any observer. That was the deal. And for a long time. It worked beautifully. Newtonian mechanics gave us bridges and buildings. Einstein's relativity gave us GPS satellites precise enough to navigate a car to within a few meters. Quantum mechanics, strange as it is, gave us semiconductors, lasers, MRI machines. The framework of reality as objective stuff was extraordinarily productive. It built the modern world. But here's what most people don't realize. Even within that wildly successful framework, there were cracks. Small ones at first, theoretical ones. The kind that physicists would mention in papers and then quietly set aside because they didn't fit anywhere useful. The double-slit experiment, which has been replicated thousands of times since the early 20th century, showed that particles behave differently when they're being observed versus when they're not. Not slightly differently, fundamentally differently. A particle fired through two slits with no detector present creates an interference pattern. Behaving like a wave, existing in multiple places simultaneously. The moment you add a detector to see which slit it goes through, the interference pattern vanishes. The particle suddenly behaves like a particle, like something solid, like something that had to make a choice. The act of observation changed the physical outcome. Physicists have been arguing about what that means for nearly 100 years, and most of the time, the argument gets filed under quantum weirdness and left alone, because the equations still work, the predictions still hold, and nobody has had a tool powerful enough to push the question further. Until now. What makes this particular AI fundamentally different from anything that came before, it isn't its processing speed or its raw training data, it's what it was designed to look for. Most AI systems, even the most sophisticated large language models and image generators you've interacted with, are built to recognize patterns in human-generated content. Text, images, code, sound. They're mirrors, in a sense, reflecting humanity's own outputs back at us in new combinations. This system, developed jointly by a computational physics team at ETH Zurich and a theoretical modeling group with ties to the Perimeter Institute in Ontario, was built for something categorically different. It was designed to ingest raw physical data, not descriptions of physics, not textbooks, actual observational data, quantum measurement records, cosmological survey outputs, particle collision logs from CERN, spectral data from the James Webb Space Telescope, and it was given one directive. Find the underlying structure. Find what connects everything. Find the pattern beneath the pattern. The team called it ARIA. Architectural Reality Intelligence Analyzer. Not a poetic name, a functional one. And for the first several months of operation, ARIA did exactly what they expected. It found known relationships, confirmed existing models, flagged statistical anomalies that human researchers had missed but that, once identified, made immediate sense within conventional frameworks. Then, in November of 2024, it found something that didn't fit any framework at all. The simulation hypothesis used to live in philosophy departments and late-night conversations. You've probably heard some version of it. The idea, most famously articulated by philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003, goes like this. If it's possible to simulate conscious experience computationally, and if any sufficiently advanced civilization would eventually create such simulations, then statistically speaking, the odds are overwhelming that we are already inside one. That what we call reality is, at its base level, something more like information, like code running on some substrate we can't directly perceive. For a long time, this was treated as an interesting thought experiment, provocative at dinner parties, not serious science. But sometime around 2024, something shifted. A paper published in Physical Review Letters in early 2024 by Dr. James Whitfield and colleagues at the University of Maryland proposed a testable framework for detecting computational constraints in physical law, not proving simulation theory, but testing for signatures that would be consistent with it. The paper was quietly significant. It moved the question from philosophy into the domain of falsifiable science. Then, in 2025, a separate team at the Max Planck Institute for Gravitational Physics published findings suggesting that certain quantum error correction patterns observed at extremely small scales bore a suspicious structural resemblance to error correction algorithms used in classical computing. Not identical, not proof of anything, but both being done and similar in a way that was hard to explain under conventional models. And then Arya found the third piece. Dr. Marcus Oyalaran is not someone who uses dramatic language. He's a theoretical physicist at the Perimeter Institute, one of the most rigorous theoretical physics research centers on the planet. He's published over 60 peer-reviewed papers. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't have a popular science channel. He gives careful, measured, deliberately hedged statements because that's what the evidence usually calls for. Which is why his written statement, released through the Perimeter Institute's communications office in March of 2025, stopped so many people cold. He wrote, and I'm quoting directly here, "The patterns identified by the area system do not have a satisfactory explanation within any current physical framework I am aware of. I am not claiming we have found evidence of simulation. I am claiming we have found something we do not understand, and that the scale of our not understanding is larger than I expected it to be." That last phrase, larger than I expected it to be, from Marcus Oyalaran. That is the equivalent of anyone else standing up and saying they have no idea what's happening, and he wasn't alone. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a quantum information theorist at Caltech, reviewed the ARIA data in the summer of 2025 and published a response paper titled simply, "Anomalous Recursive Structure in Quantum Measurement Data." The kind of deliberately understated academic title that papers get. Their authors are being very, very careful about what they're claiming. In interviews, she was somewhat less restrained. She said, "If I saw this pattern in a simulation I had designed myself, I would assume it was an artifact of the simulation's underlying code. The fact that I'm seeing it in physical measurement data is, I don't have a clean way to finish that sentence." So what did Arya actually find? What does the data actually show? Here's where I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that requires a little bit of setup before the payoff lands. In conventional physics, when you model space-time at its smallest scales, we're talking the Planck scale, which is so small it makes atoms look like planets. You expect to find something like smooth continuity, space that flows into itself, a fabric. That's the classical picture. What Arya found instead was granularity, discreteness, structure. Not randomness, not smoothness, but something with a recognizable architecture, repeating units, self-similar patterns that appeared at multiple scales simultaneously. A property called scale-invariant recursion, which in mathematics and computer science is a signature of designed systems, of systems that are running a process. Now, mainstream physicists are quick to point out correctly that granularity at the Planck scale is not a new idea. Several theoretical frameworks, including loop quantum gravity, have proposed that spacetime is fundamentally discrete rather than continuous. So finding discreteness isn't the bombshell on its own. The bombshell is what kind of discreteness ARIA found. The patterns aren't random discrete units, the way you'd expect from a purely physical process. They're organized. They exhibit what ARIA's own analysis flagged as, and this is the technical term that caused so much discussion, low Kolmogorov complexity, which means, in plain language, the patterns are simpler than they should be. They contain less information than a truly random physical process would generate. And in information theory, in mathematics and in computer science, low Kolmogorov complexity at a fundamental level is a signature of compression, of optimization, of something that is doing the minimum necessary to produce a coherent output. In other words, it looks like efficiency, and efficiency, in the context of computation, implies a programmer. Now, and this is important, I am not telling you that scientists have proven we live in a simulation. They have not. Anyone who tells you that is overstating the case significantly. What I am telling you is that a rigorously designed AI system, analyzing real physical data, found patterns that are genuinely difficult to explain under any existing model, and that some of the most credentialed minds in physics are openly struggling with what those patterns mean. That gap between "this is strange" and "we understand it," that gap is the story. Of everything ARIA uncovered, the finding about consciousness was the one that made the research team go quiet in a way that wasn't professional skepticism. It was something closer to vertigo. Here's the setup. One of ARIA's analytical modules was tasked specifically with mapping the relationship between quantum measurement events and the systems doing the measuring. This was intended as a calibration exercise, making sure the observational data wasn't being contaminated by the instruments themselves. Standard scientific hygiene. But when ARIA ran this analysis across the full dataset, across thousands of independent measurement events, it found something that wasn't supposed to be there. The quantum state resolution. The moment at which a particle stops being a probability cloud and becomes a defined, measurable thing, wasn't correlating cleanly with the instruments. It was correlating with something else, something that the instruments were a proxy for. It was correlating with the presence of conscious observers, not with measurement devices in general, not with any physical interaction, but specifically with configurations of matter that, based on their organizational complexity, ARIA's models flagged as potentially conscious, as having, in the language of integrated information theory, high phi values. High internal integration. The system was suggesting, in its dry mathematical language, that consciousness doesn't just observe the collapse of quantum probability into physical reality, it might be, in some meaningful sense, causing it. Think about what that means for a moment. Not in abstract philosophical terms, in personal terms. If the structure of physical reality is in some sense responsive to, shaped by, the presence of conscious experience, then the line between you and the world you're experiencing is not where you thought it was. The universe isn't a stage that you walk onto. It might be something that, at a fundamental level, partly becomes itself in the act of being witnessed. That sounds mystical. I know it does. And every serious researcher I've encountered who works near this data is acutely aware of how it sounds, which is precisely why they're being so careful with their language. Because the history of physics is littered with the wreckage of ideas that sounded revolutionary and turned out to be wrong. And the history of science communication is littered with the wreckage of findings that got overhyped before they were fully understood. So let me be precise about this. ARIA found a statistical correlation, a strong one, stronger than the team expected. But correlation is not causation, and the mechanism, how conscious observation would interact with quantum state resolution at a physical level, remains completely unexplained. There is no accepted theory that accounts for it, which is simultaneously the most exciting and the most humbling aspect of this entire story. In the months following the initial internal circulation of ARIA's findings, before anything was formally published, 3 things happened in rapid succession that suggested the world's most powerful institutions had been paying very close attention. First, DARPA, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, quietly expanded funding for a program called Project Qualia, which had previously been described in public documentation as a quantum computing initiative. In late 2025, updated program descriptions began referencing observer-dependent information processing and consciousness-mediated state resolution. Those are not standard quantum computing terms. Those are terms that come directly from the theoretical framework surrounding ARIA's findings. Second, the European Research Council announced a €40 million research initiative specifically focused on what they called the measurement problem at biological scales, which is a very careful way of saying they're funding research into what happens to quantum systems when living, potentially conscious organisms are doing the observing. Third, and this is the one that people in the relevant research communities found most telling, 3 major physics departments simultaneously updated their graduate curriculum to include dedicated modules on observer-dependent ontology, not as philosophy electives, as core physics coursework. These things don't happen by accident. They don't happen because a few anomalous data points showed up in one experiment. They happen because the people with access to the full picture, the people who've seen everything ARIA produced, not just the excerpts that made it into published papers, have concluded that this is worth taking seriously, very seriously. Not everyone is convinced, and I think that matters. Not as a disclaimer to soften the story, but because the skeptics are asking exactly the right questions. Dr. Priya Nambiar, a quantum cognition researcher at University College London, published a detailed 47-page rebuttal in early 2026. Her core argument is elegant and worth taking seriously. She contends that what ARIA is identifying as low Kolmogorov complexity, as evidence of compression and design, is in fact an artifact of the data collection process itself. That the sensors and instruments feeding ARIA their data are not neutral windows into physical reality, but are themselves already shaped by human design choices, human assumptions about what to measure and how to measure it. In other words, we built the tools reflect our cognitive architecture, and now we've built an AI that's finding our own fingerprints in the data and mistaking them for the fingerprints of a creator. It's a serious argument, a genuinely serious one, and the ARIA team has not fully answered it. What they've said in response is that the patterns persist even when the analysis is restricted to data sources with fundamentally different collection methodologies, optical, electromagnetic, particle-based, and that the probability of all of those independently producing the same artifact is statistically very low. But very low is not zero, and Dr. Nambiar's critique represents exactly the kind of rigorous pressure testing that any extraordinary claim requires. As of right now, March 2026, 3 separate research institutions have announced experimental frameworks specifically designed to either confirm or collapse what ARIA suggested. CERN has proposed a dedicated run of the Large Hadron Collider with modified detector configurations designed to probe observer dependency at collision scales. The Santa Fe Institute, one of the world's leading complexity science research centers, has launched a multidisciplinary project bringing together physicists, neuroscientists, and information theorists to develop a unified theoretical model that could account for ARIA's findings within a coherent framework. And a newly formed independent research collective, partially funded by the European Research Council and partially by private scientific philanthropy, has begun constructing what they're calling a closed-loop consciousness measurement environment. A lab setting specifically designed to control and vary the conscious observation conditions around quantum measurement events in ways that have never been attempted before. The results of these experiments will begin emerging over the next 12 to 18 months. And here's the thing. Whatever they find is going to matter enormously. If they find confirmation, even partial, even qualified confirmation, the implications for physics, for neuroscience, for philosophy, for how human civilization understands its own existence are almost too large to map. And if they find nothing, if the patterns turn out to be artifacts, if Dr. Nambiar's critique proves correct, that matters too, because it means we need better tools, better frameworks, better questions. Either way, we are at a threshold. That much seems clear. There's a question that keeps coming back to me. The more time I spend with this research, the more I read the papers, the more I listen to what the researchers are saying between the carefully hedged lines, the more this one question surfaces. And it's not, are we living in a simulation? That question, as it turns out, might actually be the less interesting one. The more interesting question is this: does it matter? If the universe is, at some fundamental level, computational, if reality has something like an architecture, if consciousness plays an active role in the moment-to-moment resolution of physical experience, does any of that change what it feels like to be here? Does it change the reality of grief, or joy, or connection, or the way a particular afternoon light hits a particular window at a particular time of year and makes something in you go still? The physicist Eugene Wigner, one of the great minds of the 20th century, spent the latter part of his career thinking about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics. He wrote, near the end of his life, that the most remarkable thing about human consciousness was not its complexity, but its interiority. The sheer irreducible fact that there is something it is like to be a person. That experience has a texture from the inside that no amount of external description fully capture. So, whatever Arya found, whatever the next 18 months of experiments reveal, that interiority doesn't change. The experience of being conscious, of moving through a world that presents itself to you as solid and real and meaningful, that remains. Whether it's happening on a cosmic stage or inside something more like a dream that the universe is having about itself. But here's what I keep coming back to. If reality is in some sense responsive to observation, if the presence of conscious experience genuinely participates in the structure of what's real, then every moment of attention you bring to your own life is, in some sense, an act of creation. Not metaphorically, physically, the quality of your presence, the depth of your noticing. These might not be soft, personal, philosophical things. They might be, somehow, load-bearing parts of the universe's own structure. I find that harder to dismiss than I expected to. The experiments will tell us what they tell us. The data will do what data does. It will resist our wishful thinking, and it will eventually force us towards something truer than what we started with. That's the deal with science, and it's a good deal. But in the meantime, while we wait for those results, maybe the most honest thing any of us can do is hold the question gently, not collapse it prematurely into certainty in either direction, not decide in advance what we want reality to be. Just look at it, really look at it. Because if Dr. Kovacs and Dr. Oyalaran and the dozens of researchers now circling this question are even partially right, then the act of looking, the act of genuinely paying attention to the nature of what's real, might turn out to be more consequential than any of us ever imagined. And I think that's worth sitting with.